Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a drama and horror film called The Woman. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Somewhere deep in the woods, a wild woman washes her wound before entering a cave to hunt. The woman then quietly makes her way inside to kill the wolf she's heard earlier, but instead she finds an infant being guarded by the animal. Then that night, the woman dreams about how she roams the woods freely. Meanwhile, Peggy Cleek sits by the pool away from the other guests at a barbecue party. Her mother, Belle, scolds her little sister, Darlin, for being silly, while her father, Chris, talks to a client about some paperwork. Chris is a charming and bright lawyer who loves nothing more than helping people in need. On the other hand, Peggy's brother, Brian, watches three boys bully a young girl but does nothing about it. Later on, the Cleek family finally goes home and Peggy continues to be quiet. The next day, Chris drinks a cup of coffee with his wife as he savors the quiet morning. He then asks Belle if she'd fed their dogs yet, but his wife replies that Brian will do it. After that, Chris leaves early to hunt in the woods and ignores their barking dogs in the barn. Unfortunately, several hours have already passed, and Chris still hasn't bagged anything yet. Then, he finally gets lucky when he comes across a feral woman bathing in the stream, and he quietly watches her in astonishment. Eventually, the woman returns to her cave, and that's when Chris decides that it's time for him to call it a day. At home, Chris asks Brian about his basketball practice and tells his son to be consistent with his shooting. He also tells his submissive wife to prepare dinner, before instructing all of them to follow him to the cellar and remove all of their stuff there. Belle wants to know why they have to do that, but Chris doesn't answer her question and says she'll soon find out. Later that night, Belle and Peggy both wonder what Chris is doing in the cellar. However, instead of asking Chris, Belle tells Peggy to go to bed while she quietly watches her husband from the living room. The following day, Chris returns to the woods and captures the woman using a fishing net before knocking her out. Meanwhile, Peggy excuses herself from the class of her beautiful teacher, Miss Rattan. She then returns to retrieve her belongings once their class is over, just right after Miss Rayton takes a look at her drawing. On the other hand, Brian hides his annoyance when Cindy beats him in basketball. He then returns to their classroom and puts gum on Cindy's hairbrush, and once the girl uses it and gets her hair stuck, Brian offers to help. However, he only hurts Cindy when he tries to pull the hairbrush away, but she still thanks him for trying. Cindy then yanks the brush and finally removes the gum, and Brian smirks as he goes back to his seat. Back at home, Chris takes the woman to their cellar and binds her using the improvised cables he's made. He then inspects her body and checks her mouth, and as soon as the woman regains consciousness, she bites off Chris's finger and spits out his ring. The woman also chews and swallows the finger as she glares at Chris. So he repeatedly hits her before returning home to tend to his wound and take a pain reliever. Later on, Chris returns to the cellar and puts a piece of wood behind the woman before shooting it. The woman then screams in pain as she loses her hearing, and Chris tells her he finally feels better about losing his finger. Once he's done showing the woman who's in charge, Chris takes his family to see his prisoner. The ladies are naturally horrified that Chris is keeping a wild woman there against her will, but Brian appears to be excited as he listens to his father saying that they will civilize her. After giving a set of rules on dealing with the woman, Chris orders Belle to make some food for her and asks Peggy to get the first aid kit. Then, as soon as they're gone, Chris assures Brian that the woman isn't going anywhere. In the evening, the woman angrily knocks away the bowl of oatmeal Belle has prepared for her. Everyone makes sure to keep their distance from her, and once Chris pushes the spilled food towards the woman, he reminds his family to stay quiet about their little project. Then after dinner, Darlin takes her little radio and plays music for the woman outside the cellar. Meanwhile, the woman quietly listens to the melody as she contemplates eating the food on the floor. Back in the house, Peggy stares at her bedside table, while Chris watches her from the doorway. He then asks his daughter how she's doing in school, and Peggy is obviously uncomfortable being with him. Peggy can't even bring herself to face her father, so she just intently listens as he tells her to look on the bright side of life. On the other hand, Belle arrives and listens to their conversation, and when Chris finally gives Peggy a goodnight kiss, that's just when he notices his wife. Later on, Belle asks Chris if they should be keeping the woman, but her husband doesn't answer and simply slaps her. The next day, Chris eagerly goes to work and secretly checks out his secretary. Meanwhile, Peggy once again wears baggy clothes to school and doesn't join her classmates during PE class since she doesn't feel well. Instead, she chooses to keep to herself and quietly cries, unaware that Miss Rayton is watching her from a distance and wondering why she's changed so much. On the other hand, a neighbor asks Belle if it's okay to have a barbecue party at their place, but she remembers the untamed woman being held in their cellar and politely refuses. At the same time, Brian smiles to himself as he thinks of their suffering prisoner, who's already managed to loosen one of her screws and too hungry to still resist the dirty oatmeal on the floor. Back at the house, Belle assures Darlin that Chris is helping the woman before scolding Brian for peeking in the cellar. At the same time, Chris picks up Peggy from school and ignores her when she asks him not to smoke. Once they get home, Chris quickly orders his son to feed their dogs, and Brian shows how he likes inflicting pain on others by squirting water on one of their pets using the hose. However, he instantly pays for what he's done when he trips and accidentally touches animal droppings because of their other dog. Annoyed because of what's happened, Brian makes a hole in the cellar door to make it easier for him to watch the woman before covering it up with dirty gum. Meanwhile, Peggy remembers her conversation with Miss Rayton, who thinks she might be pregnant. At the same time, Chris asks his wife to boil some water and bathes the woman, leaving Belle too stunned to speak as she watches him scrub their captive's breasts. Belle then picks up a plank of wood and approaches Chris as if she's going to hit him. But instead, she points out to her husband that the woman might escape because of the loose screw. Grateful, Chris asks Belle to instruct Brian to cut a log before telling her they'll clean the woman outside. Once he gets the woman out of the cellar and binds her, Chris asks Belle and Peggy to assist him in bathing her. On the other hand, the woman looks at Peggy's stomach and tries to speak, showing that she knows she's carrying a child. Then Chris casually bathes the woman using a high-pressure power washer, ignoring her screams as his daughter watches in horror. Peggy cries as she begs her father to stop, and when he doesn't, she bravely defies him and turns off the power washer. Meanwhile, the woman repeats the word "please" after hearing it from Peggy, leaving Chris amazed that she's finally learning something. Later on, Chris returns the woman to the cellar and cleans her wounds before putting on her the dress Belle has made. Then Chris feeds his starving prisoner, and while doing so, the woman suddenly cries and thanks him. Meanwhile, Miss Rayton calls the clique residents to inform Peggy's parents of her situation. But Peggy quickly erases her voice message. In the middle of the night, Chris quietly gets out of bed and goes outside, unaware that Belle and Brian are awake. He then goes to the cellar while Brian follows him, and Chris violates the woman as his son secretly watches. Eventually, Brian returns to his room, and as soon as Chris satisfies himself, he does the same and hugs his wife in bed as if nothing's happened. The next day, Peggy tells her mother she isn't feeling well and wants to skip school. Meanwhile, Miss Rayton becomes more convinced that Peggy is pregnant when she fails to show up to class. On the other hand, Brian doesn't notice Peggy in the living room when he returns home. He then gets a pair of pliers from his father's toolbox and goes to the cellar, where he nonchalantly cuts and stabs the woman's breast. At the same time, Peggy hears the woman's blood-curdling screams and quickly comes to her aid, demanding her younger brother to leave. Feeling sorry for the prisoner, Peggy unbuttons her dress and apologizes for what she's going through, and the woman tries hard to communicate with her. Later that day, Peggy immediately informs their mother of what Brian has done. Then, just in time, Chris arrives home from work and learns from his wife that Brian has assaulted the woman. However, instead of punishing his son, Chris justifies Brian's actions and says adolescents like him have urges. He also adds that the woman is no longer an eyesore, upsetting Belle and pushing her to her limit. So Belle reminds him of what will happen to them if he gets caught, also saying that what's happening to their dogs in the barn is enough to put him in prison. Unfortunately, Chris plays with Belle's emotions and randomly mentions anophthalmia, but she clarifies that she never condoned what he did. Annoyed, Chris asks Belle what she plans to do, so she says she's leaving with their daughters. However, she makes it clear that she won't take Brian with her, saying he's already learning everything he needs to know from his father. Insulted, Chris punches Belle in the gut before knocking her out, and Peggy can only watch as her father hurts her mother. On the other hand, Brian smirks and enjoys what's happening, not even making a move to help his mother. Then Chris instructs Peggy to get a cold cloth for Belle, and as he's about to carry his unconscious wife, someone comes knocking on the door. On her father's orders, Peggy answers the door while Chris and Brian help Belle sit on a chair. Peggy is surprised to see Miss Rayton and even tries to send her away, but her teacher is determined to talk to her parents. Chris then lets Miss Rayton in and tells her Belle isn't feeling well before asking Brian to sit with him and Peggy so they could all listen to what the teacher has to say. So, Miss Rayton slowly gets to her point and says she believes Peggy is pregnant, and of course, the girl immediately denies it. Confused, Chris wonders why she thinks that, and Miss Rayton says that Peggy is always excusing herself from class to use the restroom. Miss Rayton also mentions that Peggy is always wearing clothes that are too big for her, and that she's already showing. However, Chris insists that Peggy doesn't have a boyfriend, and asks the teacher if she's accusing Brian or him of violating Peggy. Horrified, Miss Rayton clarifies that she didn't say anything of the sort and tries to leave, but Chris just slaps her and instructs his son to get a rope. Moments later, Chris binds Miss Rayton's hands and drags her outside, despite his daughter's protests. Meanwhile, Brian casually walks beside him and watches as he ties the teacher near the barn. He even hits her when she tries to stop Chris from verbally abusing Peggy, saying all the women in their family are leeches. On the other hand, the woman in the cellar listens to the commotion outside. Finally, Chris shifts his emotions to Miss Rayton and forcibly takes her inside the barn, while Peggy hurries back home and ignores her already conscious mother to get a key. Belle is still a little disoriented because of what Chris has done to her, but she makes sure to tell Darlin to lock herself in her room before leaving the house. Outside, Brian repeatedly hits Miss Rayton with a stick before Chris brings her to the dog's kennel, where Socket, Chris and Belle's other child with anophthalmia, feasts on her flesh. Chris and Brian happily watch as the girl attacks Miss Rayton, both unaware that Peggy is setting the woman free. Despite her injuries, Miss Rayton tries hard to fight for her life. However, Socket is too wild and strong that she eventually kills her, and the two dogs join her in eating the teacher's flesh. Meanwhile, Peggy fails to say or do anything when the woman mauls Belle and eats half of her face before tossing her body aside. She then goes to the barn and attacks Brian using a lawnmower blade, repeatedly striking him until she cuts his body in half. On the other hand, Chris frantically searches for his gun to shoot his prisoner, but the woman quickly dodges his attack and disembowels him before eating his heart. After that, Socket approaches the woman, and she lets the dog-like girl eat her father's heart. Then, The woman walks to the house with Socket and accepts the bottle of water Darlin offers. She also lets Darlin taste her bloody fingers, but when she asks Peggy to do the same, and she refuses, the woman touches her belly and mentions the child she carries. However, the woman doesn't force Peggy to do what she wants, and just takes Darlin with her, while Socket tags along. Scared, Peggy remains in her spot as the woman and Darlin walk away, but eventually she chooses to go with them.
This is all for Story Recapped for today. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Tell us in the comments if you want us to recap your favorite movie. Watch other of our videos showing on the screen and leave a like because it helps the channel. And I would see you in the next video. Goodbye.